just want to thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you in such good English, such beautiful. Where did you learn to speak so beautifully? Where were you educated? Where?
A single question from Trump to Liberia's president, meant as a compliment, unleashed a global storm. It wasn't rude, it wasn't loud, but it exposed something much deeper. Why did those few words shake so many? Let's find out. The White House was hosting what should have been a smooth, symbolic gathering, a diplomatic summit aimed at strengthening ties between the United States and a select group of African nations. Flags lined the hallway, translations were prepped, and advisors stood neatly in the wings. But no one in the room or watching from around the world expected the story to pivot on a single remark. After delivering a prepared and fluent speech, Liberia's President Joseph Boakai took his seat. He had spoken confidently, representing his nation with clarity and command. The atmosphere was calm. Then, unexpectedly, President Donald Trump leaned in and commented on Boakai's English, specifically how beautiful it sounded, and curiously asked where he had learned to speak so well. The room stiffened. Boakai, visibly composed, gave a brief reply. But by then, the spark had already landed. Even before any formal statement came from either government, the damage was already underway. Media outlets began covering not just the remark itself, but the wave of frustration it unleashed across African and diasporic communities. In the age of instant reaction, nuance vanished, and the moment was seen as yet another proof that diplomacy from the West often arrives draped in ignorance. Behind closed doors, U.S. staffers reportedly scrambled to issue clarifications, trying to frame the comment as a misunderstanding or, at worst, a cultural slip. But online, the incident took on a life of its own. Within hours, the footage had spread across news networks and social platforms. On the surface, the exchange appeared harmless, even well-meaning. But beneath the optics, it struck a nerve. It didn't take long before major international headlines seized on the moment. Commentators began dissecting the deeper implication. Why was a U.S. president surprised that an African president could speak English fluently? It wasn't the language of the question that caused outrage. It was the framing, the surprise, the tone of discovery. And most of all, the subtext. That eloquence in an African leader was something to marvel at, as if unexpected. From the outside, it may have looked like a minor incident, but within minutes, diplomats, academics, activists, and citizens across the globe began to weigh in. There was a pattern, they argued, and this moment fit squarely into it. It symbolized how the West continues to underestimate African leaders, not through overt insults, but through the soft astonishment that greets competence, as if excellence must be explained away. Satirical videos and sharply worded essays flooded timelines. What should have been a simple summit about partnership had turned into a moment of reckoning about how Africa is still perceived, even in rooms where it's meant to be respected. And it didn't stop at the headline. The incident quickly became a mirror through which centuries of global misunderstanding were reflected. A compliment, some said. A microaggression, others insisted. But almost everyone agreed on one thing: it shouldn't have happened. The question now wasn't whether Trump meant offense. The deeper question was, how could a world leader still carry this level of detachment about the very nations he's seeking to build alliances with? And that question opens the door to something much larger. To fully understand why this incident triggered such a sharp reaction, one must first look at the deeper story behind Liberia itself. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. In the early 1800s, as the American Colonization Society advocated for the resettlement of freed African Americans, Liberia became the final destination for hundreds who had endured the brutality of slavery. These returnees, later known as Americo-Liberians, established a new nation, carving out settlements along West Africa's coast under the ideological umbrella of freedom, Christianity, and Western political structure. Unlike most of its neighbors, Liberia did not emerge from British, French, or Portuguese imperialism. It was born from America's contradictions, a society that freed slaves, only to send them across the ocean to live out an ideal that didn't fully exist even in the US itself. The legacy of this transatlantic transplant shaped Liberia into a nation remarkably familiar to American sensibilities. Its capital, Monrovia, is named after US President James Monroe. Its government buildings were modeled after Washington, D.C.'s neoclassical architecture. Its legal system and education frameworks were drafted from US blueprints, and most significantly, its official language, by law and by culture, is English. But this wasn't simply mimicry. Over generations, Liberia developed a hybrid identity, deeply African in its roots, yet undeniably American in its political DNA. While the Americo-Liberians formed an elite ruling class for over a century, Liberia also bore witness to the complex tensions between descendants of returnees and the many indigenous groups they met. The country experienced civil wars, democratic struggles, and rebirths, but through it all, English remained the medium of national unity. This historical context is not just trivia, it's critical. Because when an American president questions where a Liberian leader learned to speak English, it's not a neutral curiosity. It's a dismissal of a nation that mirrors the very system from which that president came. It's not just an oversight, it's a form of erasure. This isn't about the technical fact that English is spoken in Liberia. It's about what that language means. In Liberia, English is not the legacy of subjugation. It is the language of statehood. It is the tool through which the country claimed its place on the world stage. It was chosen, not imposed. It was written into law, not forced by the empire. And yet, in one moment, that foundational choice was forgotten by the very country that planted its seed. The dissonance is jarring. How could a nation with such deep historical ties to the United States still be met with such confusion from its supposed partner? The answer lies not just in Trump's misunderstanding, but in a much larger reality, that even nations born in America's shadow are still seen as distant, alien, and other. So the backlash to Trump's question didn't stem from the question alone. It was rooted in this long and layered story, a story that many Americans have forgotten, but one that Liberians carry every day. What came next wasn't silence. It was a ripple of response that spread far beyond Liberia's borders. Because while the wound was personal to Liberians, the insult was familiar across Africa. Across Africa's cities and capitals, from Lagos to Nairobi, a familiar ache resurfaced. It wasn't about language. It wasn't even entirely about Liberia. It was about the constant global surprise at African excellence, especially when it comes from places the West still subconsciously treats as peripheral. The outrage that followed Trump's comment did not spread because it was shocking. It spread because it was typical. And that was the real problem. In universities, talk shows, WhatsApp groups, and cafes across the continent, a conversation ignited. Why are Africans still being congratulated for basic competence? Why does eloquence draw astonishment when it comes from African mouths? For many, the issue was not merely the ignorance of one man, but the routine nature of the ignorance itself. This time, the reaction wasn't just frustration, it was defiance. Hashtags emerged, sarcastic memes surfaced, and opinion pieces poured in. But beneath the humor was exhaustion. Africans were tired of being treated as footnotes in rooms where they should be equals. The reaction was not about Trump alone. It was about centuries of conditioning, decades of underestimation, and the lingering effect of global narratives that cast Africa as eternally behind. Even African leaders, often cautious with public statements, allowed their silence to speak volumes. Their absence from condemnation didn't imply agreement. It revealed a deeper truth. This wasn't new. It was so common that responding seemed redundant. Diplomats have heard versions of this remark countless times behind closed doors, in investment meetings, development summits, or G20 side sessions. The same shocked smiles, the same patronizing compliments, the same tone that implies, "You're much more impressive than I expected." This time, however, it happened on camera. And that made all the difference. Because the rest of the world saw what African professionals, students, and leaders have lived with all their lives, being talked down to, even when standing tall. The reaction across the continent had another layer. It revealed Africa's growing sense of confidence. Today's Africa is not the same Africa of aid dependency or Cold War chessboards. This is an Africa building its satellites, creating fintech unicorns, forming defense alliances, and leading global negotiations on climate, minerals, and migration. It is an Africa that is tired of explaining itself to those who never bother to learn. That confidence, raw, rising, and unapologetic, fueled the wave of reaction. It was no longer just about defending dignity. It was about demanding parity. The continent's youth especially responded with sharp wit and historical clarity. They understood what the moment symbolized, and they refused to accept the usual explanations about intent or politeness. Because intent no longer matters when the pattern is this familiar. While some in the West dismissed the backlash as hypersensitive or exaggerated, the African response was anything but fragile. It was strategic, it was cultural, and it was loud. The silence from the U.S. administration only sharpened the resolve. No apology, no correction, just a vacuum into which poured all the stories, all the wounds, all the echoes of being underestimated. But the anger wasn't only directed at Trump. It pointed to something much larger, the Western architecture of diplomacy itself, where words are polished but perceptions remain outdated. And that's where the next layer of tension began to brew. Inside Washington. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Inside Washington's foreign policy circles, however, the incident triggered unease. Analysts, diplomats, and former State Department officials began circulating memos and think pieces, not out of moral outrage, but out of strategic concern. This wasn't just a PR issue. It was a credibility issue. The moment had pulled back the curtain on America's weak footing in Africa, a continent that had long grown tired of being treated as a recipient rather than a partner. What alarmed many observers wasn't the comment itself, but how unprepared the administration seemed to deal with the consequences. There was no sense of urgency, no attempt to reframe the narrative. Instead, Washington did what it often does in uncomfortable global moments: default to silence, hoping the news cycle would move on. But this time, it didn't. Behind closed doors, foreign policy advisors reportedly disagreed over how to manage the fallout. Some argued it was best to move on and avoid elevating the story. Others warned that failure to engage would signal indifference to African dignity. That internal paralysis reflected a larger problem: the absence of institutional readiness to treat Africa as a diplomatic equal. This is not new. In the last 2 decades, U.S. engagement with Africa has been inconsistent at best. Summits are hosted, aid is pledged, and press photos are taken, but real political literacy about the continent remains thin in Washington. Africa is often seen through the lens of crises, insurgency, migration, and poverty, rarely through its rising power, innovation, or strategic agency. This moment was a stress test, and the system failed. More striking was the choice to lean on intent as a shield. American officials repeated that the comment was meant as a compliment, as if sincerity could erase impact. But in global diplomacy, intent is only one part of the equation. Perception, symbolism, and historical resonance often matter more. What this approach exposed was not malice, but fragility. The U.S. diplomatic system wasn't built to deal with cultural missteps that come from the top. There are contingency plans for war, sanctions, and trade disputes, but not for moments when the face of the nation reveals an ignorance the world can't ignore. And this fragility wasn't just rhetorical, it had consequences. Several African embassies in Washington reportedly received increased inquiries from journalists and NGOs. African diaspora groups organized forums and panels to dissect the moment. Think tanks began reassessing the U.S.-Africa relationship in light of rising BRICS engagement and China's growing soft power. The silence from the White House in this context wasn't neutral. It was seen as validation, a kind of passive reinforcement that African voices don't warrant a real response. That dignity doesn't require acknowledgement unless it's politically convenient. And as the U.S. chose to say less, African public opinion heard more. What might have been an isolated media slip became a litmus test for trust. Trust that the U.S. understands its partners. Trust that its leaders are informed. trust that the respect being offered is real, not performative. But what happens when that trust breaks? That answer lies not in America's response, but in how the world's fastest rising continent is rethinking who it listens to and who it no longer needs. By the time Washington's silence had cemented itself as the default response, Africa had already started looking elsewhere, and not for comfort, but for alignment. The fallout from one comment had pulled back a much larger curtain, that the continent's most powerful nations were no longer interested in waiting for Western validation. They were now choosing their direction, and this moment simply accelerated the pivot. This shift wasn't spontaneous, it's been building for years. Across the continent, African leaders have been forging deeper ties with countries that engage them as equals, economically, militarily, and politically. China has invested billions in infrastructure through the Belt and Road Initiative. Russia has extended security agreements and energy partnerships. Turkey, the UAE, and India have built embassies, tech hubs, and trade corridors at a speed that far outpaces most Western involvement. What made the Trump-Boakai incident more than a PR problem was the timing. It arrived at a moment when Africa's geopolitical posture is changing rapidly. The continent is no longer a passive recipient of foreign policy. It is becoming an architect of its alliances. And what this episode did was sharpen a collective realization that a partnership built on condescension is no partnership at all. Several African countries are now integrating further into non-Western economic blocs. Trade agreements are being signed in yuan and rubles instead of dollars. New regional security frameworks are being negotiated without NATO's oversight. And when it comes to global diplomacy, Africa is demanding, and in some cases commanding, more seats at the table, not because of charity, but because of leverage. This moment in Washington didn't cause that movement, but it certainly revealed why it's gaining momentum. And public sentiment is shifting just as fast. African youth, educated, digitally connected, and politically conscious, are increasingly questioning the old models of international engagement. They see moments like the Trump incident not as isolated blunders, but as symptoms of a larger problem. A world order that still treats African progress as an anomaly. That's where the diplomatic damage becomes generational. Because it's not just about leaders or summits, it's about how entire populations interpret their place in the world. If Africa continues to be surprised by its marginalization in Western discourse, it will only push harder toward alliances that offer dignity without disbelief. This doesn't mean Africa is walking away from the West entirely, but it does mean the terms are changing. The days of automatic influence are over. Respect is no longer assumed, it must be earned. And in this evolving landscape, even small moments can tip larger scales. A single question asked in the wrong tone, in the wrong room, at the wrong time, can reinforce a narrative that's already losing appeal. That's the power of symbolism in diplomacy. That's the cost of not knowing who you're talking to. So, while Washington may move on, Africa is recalibrating. It is watching who listens, who learns, and who lingers in outdated perceptions. And slowly, it is choosing its future accordingly. Because for a continent rising in every direction, technologically, economically, and politically, the greatest diplomatic insult is no longer hostility. It's being misunderstood. How long should Africa keep explaining itself to people who refuse to learn? Is silence from a superpower just as loud as disrespect? Let us know in the comments section. If the West still sees Africa as a surprise, who should Africa trust instead? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.